I've talked about this a bit on my podcast in the past about like, becoming a stay-at-home mom because of how I was undiagnosed, but like how difficult it was for me to work and have a baby and all of that stress and all of that craziness. And so I heard when I was listening to your podcast interview on Faster Than Normal, when you were talking about like this very 50s housewife move to stay home and dedicate your life to your children. And I was like, oh, I felt that so deeply because it's like, it's a big decision.
Well, it's a
Yeah.
big decision. And I feel like there's like this weird unspoken mommy war where it's like you're either working full time and you're doing all of that, or you're staying at home, and the two never meet, right? Like it's this like we feel like we're all supposed to be supportive of each other, but there are these camps, and it felt weird moving from one camp to another camp, and
Oh,
you know what I mean? And we're not supposed to do that, but I feel like that exists out there.
yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, I remember, this is total, I'm not going to put this in the podcast, but like my mother-in-law, when we were living in Manhattan at the time when I had my first daughter. So we had to go back to, like, I didn't have a choice. So we had to pay rent. I had to go back to work at 12 weeks. And she would always make these snide remarks about how we had a full-time nanny. So she was always like, it must be so nice having somebody else to raise your kid. And then when we moved up here, when I was pregnant with my second child, because I was like, we have to get out of the city, like we have to be in a situation where we can live on your income alone, because I don't think I can do this. And so we moved up here and I became a stay-at-home mom, which I also was, I'm sure you can attest, it's really boring. And I couldn't be a stay-at-home mom either. I was like, I had to do stuff. I was volunteering and we're doing like, but anyway, my mother-in-law was like, you have so much potential. It's so sad. She was like, you're so smart. It's so sad. What a waste that you're a stay-at-home mom. And I'm like, youth is
Well, because it's this notion that feminism has to be one way,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like feminism isn't about our choice. It's about following this path that has been directed to us by the women in the 60s and the 70s, instead of saying feminism is about doing what's best for you as a woman, as a mom, as a human. And my mother does the same thing. So I started writing these books, and before I left corporate America, I was a partner at this big strategy firm. I was a professor at Stern. I'd done all these things. And so I'm writing these books, and literally every time she's like, how much money are you making yet? How successful are you? And I'm just like, you do realize it doesn't just have to be about that to make me an important human.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, anyway. I'm not. I want to get back to that because I do want to talk about that in the podcast, but I'm going to have to cut all of that part out because I can't go back to my mother-in-law that I'm bad mouthing her on this podcast. She is genuine. She is genuinely a lovely person. She's just also says things that you're just like, you're so tone deaf. But anyway.
Because she's your mother-in-law. That's in the job definition,
I
I
know,
think.
right? So I'm not sure how familiar you are with the podcast and the
I've
platform.
listened to it. Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
wonderful.
Of
Okay,
course.
great.
Yes.
Well, I never know. I mean, like I said, I started this not even a year ago. I'm almost coming up to my 1 year anniversary, and I really just wanted to find out if my experience was similar to other women's experience of being diagnosed. And it's just blown into this. I've just learned so much about ADHD and women and girls, and it amazes me how every story is so similar and so different. And I've interviewed quite a lot of women who had came to their diagnosis through their children. So I'm curious about that. But I also am fascinated about the fact that you wrote your books before your diagnosis, right? Like you're sort of like, yeah, I'll get to that eventually. But let's start with so you have two sons who were one of them, they're both neurodiverse. So let's usually I ask kind of what made you first think you had ADHD and what led to your diagnosis, but I feel like you kind of backed into yours after doing so much. So let's talk about kind of what made you really get interested, I guess, in neurodiversity and as a topic for children's books.
So yes,
All of that.
all of that.
There's a question in there somewhere.
There is, and I found it. My eldest son, he's 10, was diagnosed with autism around 2. And at the time, I knew nothing about autism, but I had known that there was something developmentally different about this child pretty early on. And he was my first. And I still had that like mommy instinct that said to me, something is different. And I took him to therapist after therapist after therapist to try to find out what was going on. And oftentimes they said to me, he's just a gifted kid, it's okay. And you know in your gut that that's just not right. Like, it's nice that you think I want to hear that, but that's not right. Mm-hmm. And finally, we got him diagnosed with autism and what used to be Asperger's. And I recognized that at that point, we had to do a lot of work to help him get on the path that he needed to be on. And so I left my job and I just did what people with ADHD do. And I hyper-focused on this idea that I needed to know everything. I needed to talk to everybody. And I just went in, like, I just dove into it. And I know there's kind of 2 different kinds of parents when their kids get a diagnosis. One like me, who's like, I need to know everything. I need to do everything. I need to try everything. And then the ones who put their heads in the sand and are like, I don't want this to be happening. I am not that kind of personality. And so in doing so, I realized how plastic the brain is when they're 2. And how much I could do if I really was able to work with him on getting him more comfortable to be around kids. He had all of these crazy spikes where you could give him a date and say, you'd say November 18th, and he would say, oh, well, in 2075, that's a Tuesday. And he'd be right? Like, he had this brain that I couldn't understand. But my husband and I stepped back and we're like, we could have this really, really smart, eccentric child who can't survive in the world, but could graduate Harvard when he was 12. Or we could have a kid who had a chance at a somewhat normal and happier life. And we chose B. And so instead of trying to work on those kinds of spikes, we tried to normalize his brain. And I say this because that's a hard thing to talk about, right? Like, I wanted him to be able to be comfortable in a room full of kids and never take away who he is as a person, never take away the quirkiness that makes him who he is, but still be able to function independently in society. And that's what we did. Like, we worked tremendously hard. His entire life was going to therapy and for us working on things with him. And he's gotten to the point where he has friends and he can function in school. And he doesn't now know November 18th in some random year is going to be a Tuesday, because who needs to know that? But he also knows about his autism. And we talked about it with him from day one. We called it his special brain, and that he saw the world differently than other people did. And he would tell people about his autism. And when he actually started to make friends, he would share this with them, even though, you know, as kindergartners, they don't really understand what that means. And with his autism diagnosis, I started to pick up on the ADHD. And people had told us early on that no, he doesn't have ADHD, it's just autism. And again, like, the more you dive into it, the more you know your kid, like, this isn't just the autism, there's something else going on. And I got him diagnosed with the ADHD in 2nd grade. And it's interesting because it is a Venn diagram. There are overlapping pieces to ADHD and to autism. And I keep thinking about neurodiversity as this spectrum that's not just the autism spectrum and the ADHD spectrum, but none of our brains are wired the same way. And so he got this ADHD diagnosis. And then I started to see it in my younger son. And I was like, no, I know what this is. I've seen this movie before. And we were able to get him diagnosed in first grade. And the whole time my conversations with those kids have been, this is really cool. You have this different brain. It makes you see the world differently. And my first grader once said to me, he's like, I'm not going to tell any of my friends I have ADHD because I don't want to brag. And I'm like, that's right. That's what we want. Like, this is something to be proud of. And everybody kept saying that this is genetic. And I'd always say to my husband, I'm like, where did all this come from? Who could have possibly had this? And he would laugh at me, but not say anything. And so finally, I was like, it dawned on me. I'm like, wait a minute, all of these characteristics that I'm seeing in my children, I can see in myself. And it never crossed my mind. And so I talked to my kids about it. And for my 47th birthday, wait, how old am I now? Maybe my 48th birthday. Sorry, this is not the way my brain works. I told my husband I wanted to get a diagnosis. I wanted to do a full neuropsych for my birthday. And that's because I wanted the actual diagnosis. And I went in and I did it. And the doctor's like, yes, of course you have ADHD. Like, it wasn't even close. And I came home and I told my husband, and he starts laughing. And he's like, I could have told you this from our first date. And I'm like, I know, but now it's like, it's official. It's like, I can literally say, this is why all of this stuff happened. And I've heard women on your podcast talk about what it feels like to actually get the diagnosis and what you go through. And I went through this phase of anger and sadness and joy, and it was all happening at the same time, because it explains so very much.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I think, it's funny. I was talking to my kids just this morning in kind of mentally preparing for this interview. I was saying, like, I've been talking about ADHD basically nonstop in our household. But I didn't come to my diagnosis through my children, right? So I came to my diagnosis through my therapist and the pandemic. And but I do talk a lot about how difficult it was growing up, and the issues that I had in school, and how I do kind of talk about it very openly in the terms of the negatives and the positives, and I neither of them has been formally diagnosed. I have a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, but I talk about it with them very openly about, like, it's not that I don't think you have ADHD or that you are neurodiverse. I just haven't gotten you diagnosed yet, because we are, I'm learning, we're dealing, we're coming up with our own kind of lifestyle changes, et cetera. And, and I also feel like I want to get it right when I do when I don't want to just go through the school district, because, like, neither of my kids is terribly physically hyperactive. They're not disruptive. They don't have a lot of the stereotypical traits that would get a kid pulled out of their classroom and get them a diagnosis through the school district. Or so, like, I'm just like, I think, because I've been learning so much about it, like, I want to be I just want to get it right. And so I've been, of course, procrastinating. But so I asked them both individually this morning, but, I was like, do I, what do you think? Like, do you feel like ADHD is something that is a gift, or do you feel like it is something terrible, because, like, I was worried. I was like, maybe I do paint it in such this terrible picture, because I talk about how, living a life undiagnosed and being convinced your whole life that you just, like, something was off and everybody got the manual but you, and why can't I do certain things, and why am I not trying harder, and all of this, I know I'm bright, and all of that stuff. And they both had very satisfying answers, which was like, my daughter was like, no, I think I think you credit it with a lot of the great things in your life. And, I understand that, you wish things had been differently, and that's fine. And that you're trying to do right by us, et cetera. And my 10-year-old was like, I think you're overthinking it. He was he was like, it is what it is, it's just a thing. And there's parts about it I like, and there's parts about it that, are probably difficult, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. And I was like, all right, I can live with that. But it's suddenly like I get worried that when I talk about ADHD, and I talk about the struggles that so many of us has faced, we can't help but talk about some of the shame and the grief around not being diagnosed. And then I stop and I'm like, oh God, am I painting this terrible picture of what a life with ADHD is actually like? And so anyway, that was.
No, I know exactly what you mean. And I feel like there's always this part of me that projects my own personal school experience onto what my kids are going to experience, right? Because it's this fear that you don't want them to go through the same things that you and I went through, right? That self-doubt and that inability to understand what you were missing. My youngest had a 504 meeting this past week, and I didn't sleep for literally weeks. My husband just saw me break down before this meeting. And because I was so nervous that I wouldn't be able to get him the accommodations that I knew he needed. And I didn't want him to have to experience school the way I experienced school. And how important it is for those accommodations to be in place so that he can feel good about who he is as a learner. And normally in meetings like that, I'm the one who talks, right? Usually my husband doesn't even come because I'm like, here's what I need. And I go through it. But in this meeting, I had to have him lead because I remember second grade. I remember failing spelling over and over and over again. And I remember my teacher humiliating me in front of the classroom because I couldn't spell the word socks. And it was like, am I really like this person that can't do these things? And so I project that onto my son's experience, worrying that that's what he is going to go through and how much I want to protect him from that. And I think for me, getting them diagnosed was my way of saying, I'm not going to repeat this experience, even though I hadn't actually been diagnosed yet myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of what I'm keeping a keen eye on too, which is like, at what point will a formal diagnosis lead to then the accommodations that are needed? But I'm also, again, like I would be the same way with a 504, because I'm also sort of like, I don't really know yet what they need and what they don't need. And so, we're really just, and with COVID and so much of the at-home learning from last year, like there were a lot of things that I was able to pick up on and help with. And it was such a mindset shift in terms of, no longer like I think I've talked about this with my son before, right? Like, so he's in 5th grade now, and he was never a straight A student. My daughter always came home with straight A's, and he didn't. He came home with like, 2s and 3s out of the 4 chart. And I always took that mindset of like, well, not every kid is good in school. The same thing my parents did, which was like, look, I'm not going to pressure them. I'm not going to become that crazy parent who's like, you have to come home with A's. But at the same time, like my mindset totally shifted when I saw what he was capable of with the help that he, getting the appropriate help he needed. Because I was basically his full-time tutor and assistant last year. And so it really shifted for me, where I was like, instead of always just being like, well, I don't want to pressure him to get A's, not everybody has to get A's. To like, what do you need to get your A, right? But again, I'm still worried as a parent, where I'm like, I don't want the emphasis to be on getting A's, because I don't necessarily think that is right. But I also know how so much of your sense of self and self-esteem is wrapped up in getting the A. So we need to do everything we can to figure out what you need to get the A. And I still don't really have an answer. Like, I'm not sure which way is the best way. I just know that like I want my children to feel like we have done everything we possibly can to help them succeed, as opposed to just being like, oh, well, you're not going to succeed at everything. But I
Well,
also think you don't succeed at it. Like that's, I don't know. Then I go back and forth all the time because I'm like, I don't expect my children to succeed at everything. And I also know that like when you are neurodiverse, you tend to put a lot of pressure on yourself to succeed at everything. And is that because you tend to be good at things, or is it because we grow up in a society that like pressures you to be consistent at everything? I don't know.
for me, the 504 and the accommodations are about leveling the playing field, right? My son being at grade level without a 504 does not level the playing field to me. To me, it's what does he need in place so that he could have the same opportunity to achieve as any of the other kids that are not neurodiverse. And so if that means he needs extra time, okay. If that means he needs headphones in the classroom so he can focus, during the time where it's loud in class, absolutely. But it's not an accommodation in my mind to be like, you have to get straight A's, because these kids with ADHD, just like us, are super perfectionists, right? And like, to me, it's not about that. It really is this idea of, putting in the ramp for the wheelchair, right? Like, could the kid make it up the stairs anyway? Sure. Would it be hard and terrible and painful? Yes. So let's put in the ramp, right? Like, that's how I think about it. And it's hard because like this idea of wanting your child to be the best they can be without putting that pressure on them, because it's there already. Like, how do you scale that back, and how do you have those conversations about that kind of pressure that they're putting on themselves, right? And how do you identify the things that are hard for them and the things that are gifts, and also identify the stuff that's just hard for them that has nothing to do with the fact that they have ADHD, right? Like, it's not everything. It can't be everything. It's, here are the things that you're good at because you're good at. It's not just because you have an ADHD brain. But I because it's not this homogeneous experience for all of us, we don't have that clear path. We don't have that clear guideline that says, here are the steps you need to take in order to level the playing field for your kid. And I think they keep changing on us, right? Like, every day they grow up, and so something else happens to make me change the plan. If they would only just freeze in time, I could do a much better job as a parent.
Yeah. And I also sort of feel like, I look back at my parents and how they kind of dealt with me growing up, and I can't fault them. I think they did the best they could, and I move on from that. But then there's a part of me that's also like, well, what am I not seeing? Where is the ramp? Where is the wheelchair ramp that I'm not putting in? And what else could I be doing? And it's like, parenting.
Right. Like, we can't win. I mean, it's one of these things that we're just so hard on ourselves about. And the neurodiversity piece adds that level of additional complexity to something that's already super complex.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so let's backtrack a bit because I want to talk about the book. So you started writing these children books during lockdown, right?
I did. So when my older son was in kindergarten, or even earlier than that, and we talked to him about autism, and he'd have to wear headphones in the classroom or things like that. There were not a lot, or any, that I could find, children's books with illustrations that showed neurodiverse kids, right? The chairs in the classroom all looked like normal chairs. Kids were not playing with fidget toys. They didn't have headphones on. And he would ask me, why do I have to wear headphones, or why do I have to sit in a special seat? And children's books, particularly picture books, are so great at being mirrors for young kids so that they can see themselves, so that they can feel normalized and that their experience is validated. And watching my youngest son, get diagnosed with ADHD over COVID, like over lockdown and all of that, I'm like, I need to create a tool for other parents so that this exists, right? There's a gap to me that was missing. And with my hyper focus, I sat there and I wrote 2 children's books in like the span of a month, and I illustrated them because I'm a control freak and I have to do everything. But more importantly, I wanted to make sure that the illustrations were not distracting, right? Like so often with my kids, when I would read a book and they'd have these beautiful illustrations and I would love them, my kids would be like, well, why is that, book on the bookshelf green, and completely forget the focus of the story. And so my illustrations are very simple and very clean and only show what need to be shown. The font is dyslexic friendly, so it doesn't have any curly cues. The spacing is wide. It's really, really simple, so that neurodiverse kids can follow along. And so the books are designed in such a way to appeal to this type of kid so that they can see themselves. And then they're also a great teaching tool for parents to explain to the other kids in the classroom, why is that kid wearing headphones? Why do they get a special seat? Why do they get to chew gum or have a box of fidgets or whatever accommodations those kids have? Because we're not in the classroom with those kids. It's hard to be able to talk to them about the differences that they are seeing, particularly when kids are so young. And so I've created these books as a tool for neurotypical parents too.
That's awesome. Oh, that's so beautiful. I love that. And so you've written 3, are you writing more?
I am. I'm working on.
Are you making lots of money? Are you?
There's some article at NPR for a couple of years ago that pretty much made it seem like an author was super successful if they could pull in $10,000 a year. So if this is the line of work you choose, you need, like I keep telling my husband, he's my patron, because it takes a long time to bring in a lot of money when you're an author. But
I have the same issue with podcasting. My husband is like, when do I get to quit my job? I'm like, never. Just, this is really a full-time hobby. But
I call it my midlife crisis. I'm like, it was this or getting a Porsche. So this is much more meaningful. But I'm working on the 4th book now. It's about the end of school, because, we always think about the end of the school year. Everyone's so excited about summer, but neurodiverse kids are not good with change. And this is change, and it's scary. And so it addresses some of those concerns that kids have at the end of the year. And if you talk to special ed teachers or even regular ed teachers, the kids are a little nuts at the end of the year. And part of that is this anxiety over the change that summer is happening and what will next year be like. So that's what this book is about. All of my stories are actually true stories that have happened to my kids or that have happened to other kids that I know about. So they're all based on true stories, and they're written in a structure of a social story. So in special education, a social story is a teaching tool to help a child understand their emotions and what steps to take to face a challenge. And these books are written in the very same way. So this book again will help children deal with their fears about the end of the school year.
That's so incredible. And I think, the book that you wrote about transitioning and the Emily D and the fearful first day, right? That is something I wish I had for my son when he was younger, because he has a really difficult time with change and transitions, and he experiences a lot of anxiety at the beginning of a school year with a new teacher. And so it would manifest as, he would feel physically sick. He would feel nauseated, and he would try to explain it to me where he's like, I can't go to school, I'm sick. And that, and I'd be like, okay, well, what's happening? How, you don't have a fever. And we would get to the point where he would say, I'd be like, do you feel like you were on a roller coaster, or do you feel sort of like, is that what the feeling is? And he's like, yeah, like, I feel like I'm going to throw up. And then he would get worried about throwing up at school. So he didn't want to go about that. And I'm like, you're not actually going to throw up. I mean, it's possible he could have, but we had to have a lot of conversations about like what anxiety feels like. And I think it's really sort of helped him become more in touch with the physical manifestations of anxiety, right? And so I think that that is something that like we aren't very good at as either as neurodiverse or ADHD adults. Like I feel like I had that conversation with a lot of guess about like how we kind of tamp down our intuition a lot of the time, because a lot of the things we think and a lot of the things that we do are, we're told they're wrong so much as children, and so we stop listening to our instincts. And I think that that is such a disservice. Like I feel like it's so important to teach kids to listen to all the different sort of wisdom areas that are happening in their bodies.
Right, because little kids feel stress and anxiety, right? Like we don't think about that, but they do. And particularly now after lockdowns and COVIDs and whatnot, the level of school anxiety and school refusal is just going through the roof, right? School feels like a scary place to kids right now. Mm. And one of my books, George J. and the Miserable Monday, is about school anxiety and the fact that every Monday feels like a battle for certain kids because they've made it through the week of school, and then the weekend happens. And for young kids, that change can feel really dramatic. And that fear that school is not going to be like it was last week, that everything's going to be different, is really, really hard. And look, as adults, Mondays can be hard for us, right? Like that's not just a kid problem, but giving kids the tools to talk about what those feelings are, and respecting and owning the fact that those feelings are real, teaches them about how to deal with it when they're older, before they can turn to who knows what to try to deal with those feelings. And so I think that recognition that they can really feel these things and those feelings are real is so important.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, I noticed that with Zoom when they were doing Zoom schooling last year. Like my son would just, as soon as he would get off Zoom, he would burst into tears, right? Because it was like you're holding it together. And I saw the degree to which he was like working, and it was like he was just holding his breath the whole time, right? Like really trying to concentrate, really trying to focus, really trying to do all these things where it's like the sensory world was working against him, and he would just fall apart the minute he got off of Zoom. And then I was so excited for him to go back to the classroom, but like you said, like school, yeah, it doesn't feel like a safe place. And so I was picking my kids up last year, and as soon as he would get in the car, he would just burst into tears. It was like the whole weight of the day would just he would just unravel as soon as he got into a safe space. And I was sort of, and so this year we have him in like, what's the word? Preventative therapy, where we've started getting him to see a therapist. We wanted to hit the ground running this year with making sure he had somebody to talk to, but also like his therapist was sort of like, what's wrong? What's wrong? Like there was a sense even with therapy, because okay, I'm getting tangled up. So basically we wanted to get him in a situation where he could normalize therapy, right? Where he could, where the idea of therapy was not like there has to be something seriously wrong with you in order to go to therapy, that therapy just exists as an outlet, and that we needed to normalize like verbally processing things and talking about things with adults that aren't necessarily your parents, but like, feeling like there are places where you can talk about this stuff. And it doesn't, or not, like that's the other thing. You don't have to like always come to therapy with some dramatic trauma event that you have to go over. Like we just wanted to have it available to him as a way of normalizing therapy in his life, as opposed to feeling like therapy was something that you only did if there was something seriously wrong with you, which is, I think most people think of therapy that way, right? Like couples that you don't go to couples therapy unless you're on the brink of divorce, and you don't go, and I don't think, I feel like that is a terrible way to look at therapy. So we have him doing that. And I don't know what they're talking about. Like he doesn't tell me anything. I don't really uh, pry, but like he is in such a better place just from having 1 hour every other week to like, I don't know what, like just to be in that space. It has made such a tremendous difference in terms of his ability to like cope this year.
Look, I'm a big believer that preventive medicine is important, and we do it for our physical health, but we need to do it for our emotional health too, right? My kids have been in and out of therapy since they could speak, I think. And it becomes another grown-up that they can talk to and feel safe with and discuss their feelings. And even, the school psychologist at school, I asked my second grader, I'm like, well, what did you guys talk about? And he's like, that's private. And I'm like, okay, that's good. Right. And so, because I want them to be able to turn to therapy throughout their whole life. And if it's only something that you go to when something's on fire, it doesn't really work the same way.
Yeah. I know, right? Yeah. And the other thing was like the school counselors are so overwhelmed right now. I mean, last year, at the very end of the year, their teacher, who was really holding a lot of these kids together, had to leave for on a medical emergency. So she was gone for the last month of school. And there were a lot of kids who just unraveled without her presence there. And one kid started biting other kids. And so like I called the principal and I called the guidance counselor and was like, look, my son doesn't feel safe in the classroom. Like, what do we do? And and the guidance counselors are so, they spend all of their time dealing with the extreme cases, the behavioral cases, that like they don't have a lot of resources or time for the quiet kids who are in the corner holding it together until they get home, and are just sort of like, even if the guidance counselor was to take my son into her office and ask him how he's doing, he probably would have been like, I'm fine, everything's fine, because he doesn't want to be disruptive because he's that kid. So like I really, it really sort of felt like so much came to the fore last year in terms of like, how kids are dealing with these stresses that, as grownups we're not dealing with very well. So I really do hope that a lot of this, the way in which we're talking about mental health, the way we're talking about depression since the pandemic, like, being so much more open about it, and, being able to answer the question, how are you doing? And just being like, I'm not okay. Like, I feel like as adults, we've been able to normalize that a little more over the last year and a half. And I'm hoping it really trickles down to kids.
Well, and I hope that the resources that the schools are trying to funnel to mental health stay the focus, right? Because that could be a huge benefit from all of this, that the resources are there, the social and emotional learning focus is there, that it's not just about learning algebra. That would be a great perk. That would be a great positive thing to come out of all of this awfulness.
Yeah. put that on the bucket list. So okay, so then when you were just diagnosed, I guess, we've sort of talked about this here and there in this conversation, but like, are there some things in your past where you look back and you're like, the signs were there? Oh, I know what I want, scrap that question, because I feel like we've already talked about that, but I was curious, like, what was the reaction from your family when you came out and, when you were diagnosed?
So my husband looked at me like, of
Yeah.
course, and he laughed. My husband is very hyper rational. Like, I call him a Vulcan, because he is as opposite ADHD as a human being could possibly be. And sometimes I feel like we live in like different universes that are just overlapping, because the way we see, he's like, you and the boys are over there and I'm over here. And he's like, sometimes I just stop and I watch you guys. And he's like, I can't even believe what I'm seeing. And in my mind, it all feels perfectly normal. But so he was very supportive, and the kids loved it. Like, they high-fived me, and it felt like we had this special club. And I'm not sure my mom fully believed it, because I was a kid in the 70s and they diagnosed some boys with ADHD, but goodness me, they would never diagnose a girl with ADHD. And I had done well academically and I had done well professionally. And I don't think she saw the extent of the struggle. Because again, it manifests itself differently in girls than it does in boys, and particularly in my case. But I live in a community where we have a very strong group of special education parents who lean on each other. And I talked to them about it, and everybody was really supportive and was able to then, relate their own experiences. And I think having that support network is huge. The place where it's interesting to me, where I get the greatest level of pushback, is on social media. And social media is not something I'm very good at or did before becoming an author. And whenever I write something positive about my ADHD experiences, or positive about neurodiversity, I'm floored by the number of trolls that come out of the woodwork and feel like, because my experience overall has been good, why I look at kind of the gifts that it has given me, that it diminishes their experience. And that to me is the hard part, right? That I look at my life, and my life comes from a place of privilege, and I've been able to get my kids all this therapy and do all of these things, that my positive outlook is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that's the place that's a bit interesting. But otherwise, it's been nothing but good. For me, it explained internally, it's like, this is why I couldn't read books, right? Like, I wrote a dissertation and I still couldn't read books. As soon as somebody came up with a book on tape, that was like the greatest thing anybody could have invented. And I remember listening to War and Peace in the car, doing like a drive and being like, this is what literature is. Finally, like I had that like aha moment. And this is why people like to read, because I could never digest it in any other way before that. And I walk around the house and I constantly have an earbud in my ear listening to a book, like nonstop, because it opened this door to me, audiobooks, and understanding that is because of my ADHD. It like made perfect sense, because for the longest time I couldn't understand why I couldn't really read the way other people would sit there and read. I know I totally digressed from the question.
Yeah, no, but you brought up an interesting point, which I think has been such a huge mental transformation for me since my diagnosis, which was how, recognizing how much I love to learn and how I've always been like that. I would always sort of joke about the fact that like, if I could just go to school and like learn things, but never have to take tests or be graded, I would be in school forever. Like all I do is take courses and certifications. And yeah, like I'm listening, I listen to, multiple books a week, but it'll take me 6 months to read a book. And I've just given up on reading books now, unless I have absolutely no choice. But like, this idea that like, I never thought about how much I was obsessed with learning because I had such this negative relationship with academia. And so it was like such a huge shift for me in terms of my self-esteem to really say to myself, like, my experience with academia is in no way a reflection of my intellect. And like, I had to like give myself that permission, because I didn't realize how much weight I was carrying around, believing that I was dumb, even though there was all this overwhelming, evidence to the contrary. And I think that was really what brought me to the diagnosis, was my therapist saying like, look at all that you do and think and talk about, and, and yet at the end of the day, you think so poorly of yourself. And so I get like, and I've had people reach out to me too and have said like, everybody on your podcast is so accomplished and so wonderful and doing all these things. Like, where are the real ADHD people who are struggling? And I'm like, no, that's the point. Like, the struggle is behind the scenes, right? Like, that is what I think is so important to talk about when when it comes to how lonely we feel with undiagnosed neurodivergencies, which is just like, so many of us really are, do put out this identity of being very like high performing and intellectual, but like there's just so much struggle and work behind the scenes that nobody is seeing and that you can't talk about and you don't know how to process or what to do with. And yeah, I don't remember what I was talking about either.
Well, and part of that is like, I blame society, right? Like the expectation that we're all the same and we come out of an education system that is designed for a cookie cutter education, that's just bogus, right? And so there are plenty of things I am terrible at, as we said, spelling. And to this day, I still can't spell. And even with spell checker, I have to change what I'm writing because even with spell checker, I can't figure out how to spell a word. There are things I'm terrible at, but those are not the things that I choose to focus on, right? Like I'm going to focus on the things that I do well. I'm creative. I write books. Like I do these things that make me happy as a person. And whether I'm neurodiverse or not, like that's my choice to look at the world through that lens. And that is not a neurodiverse, neurotypical issue. There are plenty of neurotypical people who are unhappy with their lives and unhappy with their success. That is the way you look at the world. But I do think the reason why so many of us have struggled and have had issues with our self-esteem and our self-confidence is because our education system does not value the things that we can bring to the table and does not allow us to show them those things, right? The IQ tests that are given to kids are not designed for kids with ADHD, right? They are designed for neurotypical kids. And so we are judging our kids based on a criteria for a different kind of brain. That's crazy. That would be like giving, looking at a cat and being like, well, why aren't you functioning like a dog? You're a failure as a cat. Like, that's not okay. So those are the things that I think we should be outraged about. Those are the things where I feel like it's time to change the way society views us. And in order to do that, the positivity has to come from us. We're the ones who have to say, no, we're worth it. We're just as good. We're just as smart. In fact, there are places that we're even smarter. So then society can start looking at us and being like, oh yeah, you're right. You are just as good as you say you are. We should change the education system to be able to start recognizing the value you bring to the table. It's not to positivity just to be positive. You and I are not talking about ADHD and women and the success women have to make ourselves feel good. We're making this message to everybody so that people start seeing these gifts.
Right? Yeah. Oh, so beautifully said. I really appreciate that because, I think you do, when we start talking about the gifts of ADHD, and I talk a lot about the problems around terms like ADHD being a superpower, and how there is a lot of sense that like when you start talking about it in this aggressively positive light, you really are brushing aside so much of the inherent privileges that you start to see the cracks in the system in terms of privilege and what children, especially children of color who are treated very differently. And then you think of women of color who are treated even more different. Like you think about all the ways in which we are treated in society and how, how difficult it is to have accommodations based on who you are and where you're growing up and where you're living. And I think so much of the, so much of changing the face of what this looks like and how we are treated is being able to advocate for ourselves, right? And being able to really understand deep down there's nothing wrong with me. If I can't, like, I love the cat dog analogy, right? It's like, if I can't do this, it's not because I'm a failure, it's because we don't have what I need to be successful. And I think this the ability to advocate comes from an understanding of yourself, and also a certain level of like confidence in order to bring that to the table, bring that advocacy to the table, and say, no, I'm not going to just sit by and let you tell me I'm stupid, or tell me I can't do the thing. But then at the same time, the ability to advocate, you need a certain level of privilege to even get to that point. And so it's, then we end up in this like hamster wheel of like, yes, society needs to change and we need to change it, but that's a tall order for a lot of members of our society. And I guess my point is like, advocacy on all levels is so important, and having these conversations is so important, and recognizing privilege, but also, like you said, like having those conversations and acknowledging it. But at the same time, like, what can I do with my privilege? What can I do? Can I help other people? Can I talk about this? Can I open up conversations? Can I make changes in schools? I don't know, like, let's try, a lot of that, as opposed to just being like, every man for himself. Take what I can and run with it. And if you're not doing as well as me, sucks to be you, which I think is a distinctly American viewpoint. As somebody who grew up in another country and moved here, that I feel like is a very distinctly American mindset of like, well, everybody succeeds on their own, and if anything smacks of socialism, we're gonna shut it down. But that's a whole other tirade.
Yes, the myth of Horatio Alger continues on, that we all start with the level playing field, and we don't. But just the fact that we talk about neurodiversity is such a change from 10 years ago, right? Like it was coined in the 90s, but it hasn't really caught on. And this idea that people are starting to say that brain differences are okay, that they're biologically significant and have been around for so long for good reasons. You see in kind of the autism rights movement, this pushback against some of what Autism Speaks has been talking about in terms of finding a cure for autism. This idea that autistic individuals say, you don't really get the right to cure me, right? Can you imagine if we tried to cure Michelangelo, right? Like these notions are new, and I think it will take time for society to catch on, but at least we're talking about them. At least we're raising them. At least we're saying, these differences are okay. They're part of society. They're part of humanity. They're biologically normal to have our brain differences as much as having a skin color difference or a height difference, right? That these conversations are happening in and of themselves, I think is what's going to start shifting society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a good segue to my question I like to ask about renaming ADHD, because we talked about neurodiversity and the Venn diagram. So if you could rename it to something a little less confusing and problematic for so many of us, would you call it something else?
I would take away the kind of the disorder piece.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really a negative framing. I struggle with what to call it. I do believe kind of putting in some concept of a spectrum is really important, because we are not one size fits all. My ADHD experience looks different from your ADHD experience, and having that understanding that it manifests still differently in everybody, I think legitimizes everybody's own experience. So I think that's an important piece to it. When I talk about it with my kids, it's all positive, right? Like we don't use They don't know what it stands for. I mean, at some point they'll Google it and they'll figure out that I've been lying to them this whole time. But I taught, the H for them is high speed, and the A is about being accelerated. And it's all about this idea that their brains go so fast, and their problems stem from the fact that they haven't figured out how to work them yet. They don't know how to downshift. And part of learning about how to deal with ADHD is figuring out what tools for you allow you to then slow down, control your brain, and then step on the gas when you want to, right? And I have boys, so the car analogy works. And I'm being super sexist and stereotypical there, but whatever, it's working for my kids. And so for me, that the notion of a spectrum is the most important piece that we're missing right now.
Yeah, I love that. I know I have these moments with my son where he'll say things like, yeah, my brain was moving really fast and my hand couldn't catch up. And so I saw that there were all these words missing in the paragraph. And that's just how I am. And I just love that. Like there's this just utter lack of judgment when he has those moments where he's like, yeah, this is how I am, as opposed to, oh, what's wrong with me? I can't do the thing. Right. Which I just like, those are those moments where I'm like, okay, you're doing something right, because he's looking at these things as like, like he said, you're overthinking it, mom. It's like,
right,
this is just, it is what it is.
And he's having these incredible thoughts.
Yeah.
And so what if his hand can't keep up just yet? Right. Like the fact that those incredible thoughts exist, that's the gift. Right. We need to come up with the technology that's going to allow him to speak fast enough to be able to get those words transcribed so his ideas stay, right? Like it's not his hand that's the problem, right? It's not his brain that's the problem. It's the connectivity between the two of them that he needs to figure out.
Right. Yeah. It always comes back to that. Like, what do you need to help you succeed? Yeah. Oh my goodness. What a lovely conversation. Thank you so much. I was so excited to talk to you about so many of these things. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. This is every time I talk to another woman who's been diagnosed, kind of when I've been diagnosed, it's just so refreshing, because despite the fact that it manifests itself differently in all of us, we have so many shared experiences. We've walked the same path.
I know, right? And it's really opened my eyes to like who I love to have the intense, deep conversations with, and how much I love them. Like they're so stimulating to me. And it's really like how I prefer to communicate. And I'm realizing like all those years that I sat like in a group of women being like, oh my God, I'm so bored. How do I get out of this? Because everybody was talking about something really stupid. Not stupid, but but just like how many times there were social situations that were unpleasant to me, and now I can realize why, because I'm like, oh, I like to get to the meat. As I've said before, the other thing I think I've just shared this before in my podcast, where I talk about this with my kids, where I'm like, I don't like small talk, and my son was like, I'm like you, I like the big talk. And so I'm like, yeah, let's get straight to the big talk. But I do want to find out about your book, so because we haven't talked about them as formally as I would have liked. So there's Benny J and the Horrible Halloween, which is about your son didn't like costume dressing up, or
he was really scared about Halloween. And for neurodiverse kids, there's a lot that's happening with Halloween. It's loud, the costumes, the change, and so it's a story about a little boy who figures out how to be brave and do something that he's scared of. And then George J. and the Miserable Monday we talked about earlier, which is about school anxiety and the anxiety of change, and how horrible Mondays can be for all of us. And then Emily D. and the Fearful First Day is about getting used to the first day of school. And then the one that's coming out in the spring is going to be about the end of the school year. So I have a couple more in my on my list that will come out. They're all available on my website, which is sivanhong.com. I'm the only person in the world with my name, so it was really easy to get a website like that. And then they're on Amazon as well. And all of my books are also available as audiobooks, because since that's the way I like to consume books, I wanted to make sure that they could be accessible to all kinds of learners.
That's fantastic. I love that. I'll put links to all of that, but I'll have to. Are the links to the audiobooks on your website as well? Okay, I
They
didn't see
are.
those. That's
Yeah.
lovely. I love that. That's what a great story, and I'm so glad you're putting these um, stories together for children. It really amazed me how, my kids are a little too old, they're kind of out of the picture book phase. So I really didn't think about how little there is out there for kids to kind of, like you said, like mirror their experiences and to really kind of talk about what is happening, in their bodies and what they're, what a lot of those anxieties that they're facing, that they don't even understand even what anxiety is. So how do we start those conversations? I think it's so great that you're doing that. So thank
It's
you
my
for
little step to change society.
awesome. Well, thank you, Sivan. It's been so lovely getting to know you, and I
Thank you
love what
so
you're
much.
doing. And
I love it. Thank you.
all right, well, take care. Bye.
Bye.